Hey everyone! So as you all know, if you're longtime viewers of this channel, I have been incredibly skeptical of many of the alternative media personalities and networks which have emerged in the previous few years. You know, those people like Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson, etc., who bill themselves as being opposition figures to the political establishment, but will then turn around and try and breed sympathy for the idea of the state expanding its influence over society, and by creating propaganda narratives which lead people towards the conclusion that statism is ideal. A good example would be the call for the US government to have the FCC create a universal terms of service which all internet platforms and users would have to follow, often referring to this as an Internet Bill of Rights, which, as I've pointed out, is openly supported by Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, and is promoted openly by Google, which is unsurprising when you take into consideration the implications of having the FCC effectively nationalize social media. Like how this would effectively make competition with these bigger platforms illegal because you would have to get a license from the state in order to operate a website to try and enter the market. It would give the state full control over the policies of every website on the open internet, and you would be sent to jail instead of just being banned from a website if you did violate the TOS. Basically, the so-called Internet Bill of Rights would only exacerbate the problems which we already have with censorship and the anti-competitive market of social media, which, may I remind you, is caused by government subsidies, regulations in certain countries, the state covertly influencing their policies through political think tanks such as the Atlantic Council, government employees becoming influential figures within the companies in question, or having the FDIC arbitrarily determine certain businesses to be high-risk clients if they associate with certain political figures, so that banks will have to disassociate with the payment processors or the server hosting companies if these websites don't disassociate with certain users on the platform, or else they'd be sued by the state for violating finance laws. But yes, it's a well-documented fact, which I've gone over time and again in my other videos, that the US government has complete control over all of the media which is presented through mainstream television and radio networks through programs like the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, the FBI's COINTELPRO, and even without these, the fact that you need a license and FCC permission to broadcast on television or the radio points to this being the case. If you're still skeptical, even bearing this in mind, there's an entire branch of the US government which was set up specifically to create domestic propaganda for the state, public diplomacy and public affairs, or as the official .gov page for this department puts it, quote, "The mission of American public diplomacy is to support the achievement of US foreign policy goals and objectives, advance national interests, and enhance national security by informing and influencing foreign publics, and by expanding and strengthening the relationship between the people and the government of the United States and citizens of the rest of the world," end quote. Which, for the record, this branch is part of the State Department, which makes it a section of the executive branch of the U.S. government. The CIA and the FBI both directly take their orders from the executive branch. But if you're still not convinced, here's a clip of Richard Stengel, the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs and former managing editor of Time magazine, on a panel hosted by the Council of Foreign Relations, admitting that the U.S. government, and every government for that matter, is creating single hegemonic narratives, which every single narrative created by every single mainstream media outlet conforms to, and that their media is having a hard time propagandizing people, specifically because there are alternative news sources which the state doesn't control now thanks to the internet. Let's go ahead and play this clip.
There's another word for master narratives. It's called history. Basically, every country creates their own narrative story. And you know, my old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. We haven't talked about propaganda. Propaganda, I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it. and they have to do it to their own population. And I don't necessarily think it's that awful. And this idea of a news cartel, I mean, I was editor of Time in 2012 during that election, and I remember, you're competing against cartels and everybody. I remember being on a panel with the then editor of the New York Times, who said, it's really hard to break through these days. This is the editor of the New York Times saying it's hard to break through. I wanted to jump off the platform. Like, what's it like for the rest of everybody? So, I mean, there are cartels, but cartels don't have hegemony like they used to. The gentleman right there, last question.
I don't think you all address an issue in terms of understanding what happened in the world. Because what is happening in America is what the United States flipped on the global south and in the third world, which we live with for many, many years, in terms of a master narrative that was and still is propaganda.
So, taking all this into consideration, it is more or less an undeniable fact that there are controlled opposition figures and outlets operating within the media, pretending to be quote-unquote anti-establishment, but are really pawns whose every move is directed by the U.S. government in the interest of the U.S. government, and exist in order to capture the attention of disenfranchised people to convince them of things and to support positions which are safe for the political elite and are beneficial to the state. So, back to social media. As I'm sure most of you know, there are a couple of platforms which are attempting to present themselves as being competition to the likes of YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, which have received coverage in mainstream media outlets, mainly hit pieces designed to signal to people that those are alternative media platforms which the political establishment supposedly is afraid of, weaponizing the Streisand effect by utilizing some reverse psychology. Which, by the way, there's this incredibly asinine narrative floating around which is being promoted by people who I assume are misled but well-meaning, like Computing Forever or Stick, Sex, and Hammer, which, by the way, I've heard regurgitated on Fox News as well, so I have no doubt that in part the state is at least partially responsible for the propagation of this idea. But people have been arguing that the political elite just don't understand memetics or social media, and that they just keep unwittingly making all these figures more popular because they don't understand. Come on now. These companies, think tanks, and government agencies collectively spend billions every year specifically researching advertising strategies, demographics, what appeals to them, and propaganda tactics. They are fully fucking aware of the fact that by manufacturing a superficial schism between a couple of their controlled media outlets and personalities, they can make one or more appear as if they're diverging away from the interests of the political elite. How do I know for sure? Well, aside from the fact that the mainstream media repeats this behavior over and over and over again for personalities who espouse views which are beneficial for the state, 2 words: Fox News. If a fucking mildly autistic man who makes news videos and talks over a fucking Anthro Fox avatar could figure it out, then I'm pretty sure multinational conglomerates and some of the most influential governments in the world could figure it out as well. Anyway, recently the company known as Gab, attempting to bill itself as an alternative to Twitter, created a browser extension known as Dissenter, which has also been getting some attention on mainstream media outlets as of late, and what Dissenter does is it allows you, through your Gab account, to comment on any web page, regardless of whether or not there's a comment section on it. The expressed intention is to curb internet censorship through algorithms or by removing comment and or comment sections. And Google removed this application from the App Store. Same goes with Mozilla. In response, Gab began the development on a web browser specifically for Dissenter, but was created by forking the Brave browser, another alt-tech platform, which, by the way, I'd advise against using because Brave's source code has Google trackers on it. If you want a good open-source browser without any trackers, Pale Moon is the best one that I'd recommend as of right now. And apparently, one of the developers for Brave, Brendan Ike, started getting into it with Gab's official Twitter page over this, specifically because he's arguing that Gab is trying to undermine the Brave Attention Token, or BAT, a cryptocurrency which could be mined by people who are using the Brave browser for using it. This exchange went back and forth for a little while, which was mostly just ad hominems, corporate speak, and a bunch of autistic screeching, until another developer came in who also works on Brave, Samson, and he started poking around at the code being used by Gab and their application Dissenter. What he found is pretty damning, so much so that after only 2 comments in the thread, Gab's Twitter page stopped responding and immediately started doing damage control. So, apparently, what Samson discovered is that when you have the Dissenter extension enabled, every URL you visit is sent to Gab servers. Not only this, but Dissenter uploads cookie data onto your computer to access background applications, which are then used to track your browser settings and other programs you have running, such as a VPN, for example, then sends this info to Gab servers and forever associates all of this activity with your Gab account, effectively allowing for each user to be monitored and tracked even more extensively than through Google or even fucking Facebook, because this shit allows them to track your web activity even with VPNs. In fact, this appears as if it was specifically designed to undermine VPNs. So, this confirms something which I've been weary of and was suspicious of for quite some time, which is that within alt-tech, much like with alt-media, there are state-sponsored, controlled opposition applications being created specifically to honeypot disenfranchised and politically informed people with the purpose of collecting information on them. And Gab is hardly the only one. DLive bills itself as a decentralized open-source platform, but has a closed source code and is synced with your Google account, strongly suggesting that the application is proprietary and not decentralized. Then there was Candid all the way back in 2017, which was posing as a competitor to Twitter, but turns out was actually just a honeypot created by Google to train their algorithms to target disenfranchised and, well, politically informed people. And really, the more you think about the sort of things Andrew Torba and people like him have been saying, the more the pieces start to fit together and the true intentions behind their actions come together. The rampant logical contradictions in their presentation, for example. Like how if Torba wanted the government to nationalize social media and doesn't think that competition is a viable means of fighting tech censorship, why did he create Gab and Dissenter? Or how is the state having a coercive monopoly over all of the internet and criminalizing political opinions they don't like going to solve the issue of social media companies engaging in anti-competitive practices and censoring people for their political beliefs, which, again, is something that the state is actually responsible for. You encounter the same problem with controlled opposition in the mainstream media, where they'll make arguments intended to appeal to certain demographics in order to try and win them over back to the establishment and statism, and then to have their arguments conclude with a point which doesn't follow from their premise, because basically they have no way to make what the crowd of people they're attempting to appeal to advocate for seem beneficial to the state, so I guess they just needed to remind people the government is the only solution by just clumsily cramming that in at the end, like markets becoming decentralized and counter-economies forming as a result of innovation, and legal trade being unprofitable, naturally concluding with statism being eventually innovated out of existence because of the state being unable to collect revenue, but somehow arguing that there should just be small governments as a result, whatever the fuck that means. Which, aside from overt paper trails and connections to the state or state-controlled entities, is a good way I've found to tell whether or not someone is controlled opposition, though this isn't a certainty, so be careful. I've heard people like Computing Forever and Styx Hexenhammer making similar arguments, and I'm pretty sure that they're not shills. I've just noticed a lot of people like Jordan Peterson, Tucker Carlson, or Alex Jones doing this and leaving me scratching my head, wondering why they can't seem to put the pieces together, only to find out later that they're all controlled opposition. I think Tucker Carlson is obvious, but Alex Jones's show was broadcast on KJFK-FM, a COINTELPRO front company, and Jordan Peterson was on a radio show back in October of 2016, admitting that he was the writer of the 2013 revision of the United Nations Sustainable Development Program, also known as Agenda 21. But that's the real difficulty with weeding out shills from people who genuinely believe in what they're saying, because the people who genuinely believe in what they're saying will start repeating the arguments made by the shills, which is why controlled opposition is such an effective tactic for the state. Anyway, in conclusion, you are all probably aware of controlled opposition in the media by now as viewers of this channel, but you might not have been aware of controlled opposition in alt tech. Beware and make sure to thoroughly research the applications you find before using them, and maybe share this video around to help spread the message and warn your friends. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.